Hello and welcome to our webinar today. Today we have Jason Little from Canada, famous for being the inventor of lean change management. So for those of you who know us already, we are the Scrum Network. We are a training and consulting company mainly for Scrum and Agile transformations out of Bogota, Colombia, but operating in all Latin America. If you want to know anything more about us, please go to scrumnetwork.com. And with that, please say hello to our guest today, Jason Little. Jason, thank you very much to take the time. I guess you are very busy, so thanks for taking the time to talk to us a little bit about lean change management.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for the invite. I appreciate it. Cool. I can just go ahead and get started.
Okay, yeah, all yours.
Right on. All right. So feel free to throw questions in anytime, anyone. So I'll see them in the Q&A part. We're going to do a 15-minute Q&A afterwards anyway, but if anything kind of pops up, and toss that in the Q&A or toss that in the chat. And all right. Pop the chat over on this side, and there we go. All right. Cool. So is my screen showing okay? Any yes or thumbs up in the chat? All right. Awesome. So today what I'm going to chat about is some ideas based on the last, I guess, what year is this? 2022, 6, the last 8 years or so since the second version of Lean Change came out. So lessons learned from visiting, I don't know, 14, 15 different countries and companies in all shapes and sizes, and finding out what was getting people stuck with change and what was getting them unstuck. And hopefully this will give you some good insights into when it comes to change. There's a lot more similarities than we tend to think. A lot of companies I visit say, well, we're special, we're unique, our challenges are different. They're all the same. The challenges are all the same, but there's some good ideas and some good patterns that we can look at to figure out how we can help companies kind of move things forward. So how did we get here? I guess the origin of the ideas was something that I think many Agile coaches can relate to. So I was working in a giant telecom, and this was before Agile transformation was such a big deal like it is today. And it didn't seem like anything was working. So didn't seem like a lot of people wanted to do this Agile stuff. And from my view as the coach, I thought, well, this is really simple. Why don't people get this? We were piloting Scrum on a bunch of teams.
Can I interrupt you one second? We get lots of messages in the chat that the translation is really the translation volume is really low. Juan, if you hear me, can you try to, I don't know, boost your mic or speak closer to the mic? Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, Jason.
Yep, no problem. I wasn't sure if it was me because I can yo libro español me, so I could kind of tell that there was something with volume, so I started talking louder. I don't know, so I didn't know. I wasn't sure if it was me.
I guess the translation.
Yeah. Okay. So we were running quite a few Scrum pilots. I was working with a whole bunch of different teams. I was working with business teams. I was working with auditing teams, marketing teams, and all of those different groups were following some flavor of Scrum. And I'll say flavor of Scrum because the software teams were doing it the way it's supposed to be done, and the non-software teams were kind of a little bit stuck. And, after 8 months, it just didn't seem like this transformation was really going anywhere. So I did a talk at the Agile 2011 or 2010 conference, I can't remember, about how people could get started with Agile when they don't know where to start. And that turned into a live lessons series, which I think Front Row Agile, I don't think is a thing anymore. I can't remember what bought them. But there's, you've probably seen Safari Books Online and Inform IT. They've had a bunch of these live lesson things that have gone out. So Lisa Adkins and I went into their studio and kind of launched that brand. She did her Agile coaching thing. I did my Agile transformation one. And it was about, something's going on here. Why is something that is so simple to do so difficult? And back then, maybe Diana Larson, James Shore, Esther Derby, Johanna Rothman, those folks, they had been talking about Jerry Weinberg talked about this in the 60s, the organizational impact of Agile, but it wasn't really as big as it was today. So they wanted me to write a book on that topic, and I did nothing. And then that eventually turned into the live lessons, and which was actually better. And then all of the ideas and things that I was trying with organizations didn't really have a good story to wrap around those ideas up until the book came out in 2014. So the company I was working with, I released it chapter by chapter, lean startup style. And the intent was just to tell the story. There was no intention for it to turn into what it has become today. And people seemed to like the story. They seemed to like the ideas. And then I went on what I like to call the world's most boring world tour, the change management world tour. So, no big stages and pyro and all that kind of awesome stuff. But my mission was finding out what companies were really kicking ass with change, which companies were doing great, and what was it about what they were doing? Because it's easy to say as the consultant, they don't get it, they don't have the mindset, and some of these oversimplified easy answers that you see plastered all over LinkedIn. A great one I saw a couple of weeks ago was, what's the right way to transform? And the answer is get everybody involved. And I'm like, oh, come on. Go into Bosch, this little company with 450,000 employees, and say, get everybody involved. These oversimplified answers just never really sat with me. So I wanted to find out, what these companies were really doing. So all the stuff that I'm going to show today, and this year is really the next generation and the evolution of all of those ideas. So there's an interesting story from John Seely Brown, who was the leads at Park Research for Xerox. And I don't know if people know that Xerox arguably invented the laptop and the computer mouse and the graphical user interface. But guess how much money they made off of those innovations? And if you know, just throw something in the chat. Like how much money would you guess that they made off the invention of those things? Zero. Yeah, it's zero. They made nothing. So John Seely Brown, who was, he had the best employees, they had the best building, they had the most innovative practices, they had everything that was set up in a way for that to be successful, and they didn't make any money. And in his own words, he said it was because he didn't have the relationships with the people who made all the money for the company. He was just kind of perceived as this nut who gets the pool tables in the bowling alley in this cool building, and they're not making any money for the company. And he wasn't very open and transparent about helping the rest of the company do what they were doing in the innovation space. So in his view, it was more about, especially nowadays, if you went on LinkedIn right now, you'd probably find 10 to 15 new models that have been invented because we're in such a rush for the next big thing. There's so much not invented here syndrome going on. And everybody wants to look ahead for the next big thing. No one wants to kind of stop and look around, because all the ideas about change are as old as humans. And in his view, it was the way ahead is to stop and slow down and look around instead of always looking for the next big thing. And what I found was, there's this perception that change managers, they want the best practices, they want the best processes, they want the best method. And you'll see all the experts saying, here's what you need as an agile coach, or here's what you need as a change agent. You need this new method, you need this new certification, you need this new book, you need this new whatever it is. And what I found people actually wanted after traveling for, I guess, the greater part of 6-7 years, up until we weren't allowed to go outside anymore, was they're getting stuck in the intervention points. It's not, first of all, 0% of them that had a prescribed change approach used that approach. None of them. I've had so many companies where they're like, we're a ProSci shop and we're partners of them and we have all their templates and their methods and their tools and whatever. We never use any of it. Well, then why is the method the problem? Why aren't you using it? Well, it's too heavyweight. There's too much emphasis on just following the process and not enough emphasis on this, that, and the other. And what we really need is, what can we do next week to get things unstuck? Very much intervention based. So, change isn't going well. We've got an update meeting with the stakeholder on Friday. Everybody's upset. People are burned out. What the hell do we do? And a method's not going to tell you that. A method isn't going to give you a step-by-step process for how exactly to do that. So kind of 5 patterns emerged from companies that were figuring out how to live in that intervention spot and move things forward. So yeah, so basically this is just what I described. Change isn't going well. What can I do? I need a way to intervene and jiggle the system to get it unstuck. I don't really need to create a new method, or I don't need to throw out the method that I have right now. So the previous, so this, I had a stack of thousands of these stickies collected, which was, where are you getting stuck? How are you getting unstuck? And I went through and mapped them all and came up with what was the main problem. And this is what people were asking for. A lot of what we do in change is outdated. We want more modern tools and practices. We want a new way to look at change. So there's kind of this perception that change is a controlling function. So we define the change and we roll it out across the organization, and we're the face and the voice of the change as the agile coaches or the change agents. And it's not working. So how can we look at it differently? The third main thing was, how do we get more people on board? How do we create alignment? How do we co-create when we have the problem of change being dropped through the hole in the floor? And what that means is the people at the top, which is kind of Arturo's question, is top-down approach still valid for change? Top-down it's often referred to as dropping the change through the hole in the floor. So the thinkers up here come up with a change, they drop it into the organization, and the change managers steamroll the organization with it. And there's no alignment around why this change, why now? And there's no thought around, how do we question this change because the top leaders have told us that we have to do it. So is it still valid? Sure. I mean, you can look at, I pick on the banks in Canada a lot because they're fun to pick on. They're what is known as an oligopoly, which means the big six control the entire banking ecosystem. They have been transforming for 15 years. Every 12 to 18 months, they run a new agile transformation program. They get a new method, they get a different set of consultants, and they just keep improving their processes. They don't really change anything in a drastic way, because that's all coming from the top. We need to do a digital transformation. We need to install SAFe, DAD, Nexus, whatever it is. And when you actually look at that, it's fun to make fun of them for doing those things, but they don't really need to do anything differently. They just need to protect that entire ecosystem. I still get emails from my bank where they say, did you know you can check your balance on your phone? I'm like, yeah, I could do that by dial-up in 1994. Like, how is this innovative? So top down, generally speaking, there isn't a real deep sense of purpose or need for the change to happen. It's what Cotter calls false urgency, from what I usually see. And is it valid? For sure it is. You're not going to go into a highly regulated environment and do a completely bottom-up co-creative approach. And there's no real such thing as it's just top down or it's just bottom up. It's more complex than that. I think the key in that is being aware of the consequence of just using the people at the top said, do this, so go do it. There's consequences that we have to live with. And then the last thing on the list here was organizational physics. So how do we overcome resistance? How do we deal with inertia? How can we get inspired? Because a lot of the times doing change work just honestly sucks. It sucks when you're the change agent and you're in there by yourself, and you're really having a hard time, getting people to figure out what this change means to them and how do we move it forward. And we need a support system too. All change agents need a support system. I don't know if this is common for anybody on the webinar, but every gig I've had, I've always hired an external coach for myself every single time, just to be able to have somebody to bounce ideas off of and get feedback from. So having a support system and really understanding organizational physics was something that people wanted to figure out. So this is fairly obvious, but the constantly changing variable in change is people. So it's kind of unhelpful to say we could follow the same set of steps in two different organizations and have success, because people are always the variable and people are always changing. The organization's culture is always changing and adapting based on what's happening in the market, what's happening with people, obviously because of COVID. So we're kind of in a system that's always changing, and it's very difficult to just look at a set of steps and say, we've created a snapshot of the current state, we've created a snapshot of the future state, now we're going to manage the transition towards it. Because while we're doing all three of those things, the system keeps changing anyway. So what can we do about that? The next generation of ideas is kind of like AI for change agents. So some people really like, feel free to throw something in the chat. If you really like, who really likes tools and mental models? That's kind of the first place that you go to when you're trying to do a change in an organization. You want to look at Canavan or the Stacy matrix, or you want to take some mental model or idea. Some people are those types of thinkers. And other people are tool thinkers. I have this problem. What tool can I use, or what process or practice can I use? And then you've got other people that go, maybe there's something I'm not seeing right. They put it on themselves and they think, is there something about what's happening that I'm just not seeing what's really going on? Is there something about the approach that I'm taking? Am I the one that's creating resistance by the approach that I'm taking? So we all kind of come at it from different angles. So this 4 dimensions is about exactly that. How do we balance the art and the science of change? A tool will be used based on who you are as a person. I've gone to plenty of, traditional change management conferences where, they want to do this innovative open space, and they assign people to areas and they create the topics ahead of time. And we all know that's 100% opposite of what an open space is. And we can go, look at those dummies, they did it wrong. Why are they doing that? Well, I actually talked to these groups and asked them, like, why? Well, it's our responsibility to provide a good experience. If we open up topics to everybody and no one has one, they're going to blame us for putting on a bad conference. Well, then now we got to it. Now, what's the problem with that? Whereas, so we've kind of got to start from where we're at. And these 4 dimensions give you something to look at. You can look at either challenging your own assumptions and your beliefs, or you can look at some new tools, or you can look at some big ideas. And the insights, options, experiments is really, how do we get from A to B? How do we use a feedback-driven approach to move ourselves one step ahead this week? So a global client I'm working with now, we do this every week. It's what are the 3 most important things in the context of our strategic change canvas? What are the 3 things we're going to do next week to get closer to the vision that's on that canvas? And then the following, it's very Scrum-like. It's very much, you know, here's the 3 things we've committed to for the week. At the end of the week, we do a review and a retro. We go, what happened with those 3 things? Did they work? Why or why not? Should we pivot? Should we pursue? Should we stop the change? And the great part about that is at one point, one of the changes we actually did stop. So what had happened was they had realigned some teams or did like a miniature reorganization type of thing, which pretty much invalidated a lot of what we were doing with this change. And we just agreed to do nothing until the reorg dust settled, which was great. And then the 5 universals and all of the elements are, think of it like a chemistry metaphor, right? You combine elements to make compounds. So how do you take the bits and pieces of this ecosystem to create an approach that's most likely to work in your organization? So I'm going to go through kind of the 5 patterns from that Change World Tour and share a few stories about companies that were really aligning to these 5 things. You know, the first one being, we're taught that urgency, we have to create urgency to make change happen. That's Cotter's first step. The problem becomes urgencies in the eye of the beholder. So the organization's urgency is different from the leader's urgency, which is different from the board, which is different from the people on teams. So whose urgency are we talking about? And do we really care if, you know, I've had people on teams say, what do I care if we raise our revenue 3% and some rich dude gets a whole bunch of more money? Like, why does that matter to me? So how do we flip the conversation away from this urgency, which is not really helpful, and flip it more towards a strong purpose? And this company in the picture here, they were expecting to double in size over a year, and they were a little bit freaked out because they wanted to keep the good things about being a startup, but they didn't want things to get completely out of control, so it was chaos. And after this Lego, and they thought they needed Agile to do that. So I came in, ran that Lego Serious Play session, and the model that you see in the main part of the screen, the little pile underneath was all the things they changed over time. So they said, you know, we've rebuilt our platform twice because it needed to be done, but we didn't need to over-engineer it at the start because we wouldn't have been able to get all of our customers if we spent 3 years building this. So that represents all the things they changed. And the structure is, there's a little flag right in the middle, and that's their vision is to provide better quality healthcare services. And that's their existing structure. So they realized their superpower was, we have a strong sense of purpose about providing healthcare solutions, and we know how to reinvent ourselves when necessary. So they rally, instead of the urgent part, we flipped the conversation towards creating a stronger sense of purpose with them. So the good thing is it worked really well. And the bad thing, I guess, for me was I didn't get hired because they realized they didn't need any more coaching. It was, right? The next of the 5 universals is meaningful dialogue over broadcasting. And in the change management world, there's this sense of, you know, we have to communicate at people 20 times for the message to sink in. And often they'll say things like, we have 2-way communication. But there's a subtle difference between dialogue and 2-way communication. And meaningful dialogue is we're always questioning why we're doing this change in the first place, and we're willing to change that. Communication is, I'm trying to convince you that you need to do this change that I said we have to do. So it becomes more of a coercion tactic or a broadcasting tactic, sit people in front of a TV and show them change communications until they give in. And that's absolutely not what it's about. This picture here, we ran a summit with this organization. I worked with them on and off over a number of years. And we'd have the CEO and the CTO on stage amongst some other people, usually a couple of hundred people in these sessions. And we use this tool called Slido to get real-time feedback about the transformation. So anonymous questions that the audience voted on. Is this event making it clear why we're doing this? And the results are right there on the screen. Typically what happens with communications folks is when they do question sessions or feedback sessions, they only want to show the good stuff, right? They don't want the leaders to be asked a hard question. So I don't know if people have been to these big town hall thingies where somebody walks around with a microphone and says, do you have questions? But those questions are preceded. Those are questions that the comms people want the leaders to be seen answering. This is the exact opposite. This is, we're here to facilitate meaningful dialogue. And one of the questions that was asked in this session was, somebody asked the CTO, you keep telling us how we need to change. What are you prepared to change? And that got voted, obviously, and way up to right up to the top. Nobody's going to ask that question with a mic stuck in front of them, but because it was anonymous, we made it safe, and he answered it. He said, well, we have 7 layers of management. We're planning to shrink that to 3. We know that's going to upset a lot of people. We know we're going to lose people, and we know the next 2 years is going to be rough on our customers while we decommission services and completely change things. And people were shocked. And I've never heard leaders give an answer like that before, which I thought was fantastic. So the companies that were focusing on enabling meaningful dialogue and not just a bunch of pretty emails with communication, they were finding how to move things forward. The next one's pretty obvious. Apologies for the bad quality of the picture. This was from the iPhone 3 days, so that should tell you how old this was. How do we, if you've worked on transformations where at the end of the year-long program, the status report's green, all the tasks are done, but nothing's different. I'm sure there's people that have seen that. How do we focusing on experiments over just executing all the tasks? I work with a lot of clients that use Scrum metaphor to do change. The problem becomes, when you're using Scrum, you have something to show for it at the end of the sprint, whether that's a week or 2 weeks. When you're using Scrum with change, a lot of the work or outcomes, it's invisible. So how do you do that in a sprint review? The idea with experimentation is to try to figure out what is it you can make visible, however small it is. And this global client I'm working with now, we're using a lot of Fist of 5 very early on. So you've been experimenting with change canvases over the last month from 0 to 5. How much better is it than the old way you used to do change? And we track that as a diagnostic, not as a measurement, because it's obviously not scientific, but that's our experiment. That's a way to show, here's the problem, here's our hypothesis, here's what we're trying to get to. Here's the diagnostic that tells us we're at least going in the right direction. And if we're not going in the right direction, let's stop the change or do something else. This picture was a company that had really, really bad technical infrastructure. So frequently there were 16 teams and their code repo was a mess. They would frequently break things. And trying to untangle that was very difficult for the build and integration team. So our experiment was putting that siren in the bottom middle of the picture. So whenever the build would break, the siren would go off. It would be a visual notifier that something is now broken, and they could fix it. And they used it as a training mechanism. Now, because this is 12, 13 years later, they still do this, but it's more sophisticated. Because the technology back then didn't exist to do what they're doing today. But they used it as a training mechanism. So if somebody checks in some code and it breaks everything, they don't punish the person. They go back and use it as an opportunity to do some training. And it all started from that experiment. The next one is how do we move away from getting buy-in? Getting buy-in is another one of those common things in the change world. So how do we get those people to buy in? And I've had so many change agents over the years who've they've either come to a class or I've gone into their company and they said, how do I get the leaders to buy into this change? And for me, I'm like, what the heck are you doing? Like if they don't want this, why are you doing anything in that organization? You know, shouldn't we be aligning people around why this change, why now, not just thinking of a change ourselves and then trying to get them to do it? So if we focus on co-creation, there's nothing to sell. If we build the change with the leaders, with the managers, with the people on the teams, we don't have to sell anything to anyone. We'll always find what the right change is. And the picture on this slide is an organization that wanted to do an agile transformation, and we looked at the 3 different perspectives. So the top left is the organization's perspective. Like, why does the organization want to do this? Why this change? Why now? And the top right of the picture is, okay, as the team of managers in the room, why do you want to do this? What's in it for you? And at the bottom were teams and people. So now what's in it for the people on the actual teams? And we looked at the similarities and the differences, and we came up with a path forward. I think we had like 4 or 5 experiments to run over the first month or so. But by going through this co-creation process, we were able to kind of flip the metaphor from dropping change through the hole in the floor to diffusion, which is more consider the perspectives of everybody affected and then find what the right experiments are. Once we understand what's in it for the people in the teams, what's in it for the managers, what's in it for the people in the organization. So a co-creation question, how do you choose the right people in co-creation spaces? What practices do you use to measure the diversity of these teams? For me, the right people is typically the movers, the people that want to be there. I'm a fan of inviting everybody at the beginning, so open invitation. If we've just decided we want to start an agile transformation tomorrow, we do an open space. You know, if we've got 50,000 people in the organization, we do a distributed asynchronous open space over a week where we can use mural or Miro boards and we can asynchronously do an open space to gather some insights and do some co-creation activities. So the right people are the people that keep coming. And measurements and diagnostics are things like energy level, pirate metrics, who keeps coming back to these sessions, what are we learning? So very fuzzy, more diagnostic types of things is typically what I will go for, especially early on in change, because it's impossible to know what all your measurements are at the beginning. You can't say we're going to run an 18-month transformation and know exactly what our outcomes should be. It's impossible. You can make a good guess, but it won't be right. So if we focus more on diagnostics and course corrective diagnostics, what feedback can we get early that tells us we're at least headed in the right direction? And the same global client, we're actually doing measurements on our diagnostics. So we have a usefulness score for our measurements over time. And when they stop becoming useful, we'll stop doing them. And that's difficult because that's, you know, we're so locked into, once we have the measurements, those can't change because we want change to be scientific, but it really isn't because humans are too finicky. It's too chaotic of a system to come up with a static measurement that's repeatable. You know, you can repeat the same experiment with gravity over and over again because the constant of gravity is not going to change in a vacuum, right? That's not how organizations work. So the experimentation question, yeah. So the main challenge to creating an experimentation culture, that's finding people who are willing to take the risk to try an experiment. And getting a sense of what the culture is like and what the learned behavior is like. I find that the perception that leaders don't want mistakes to happen is usually worse than what happens when mistakes actually happen. And we usually don't have this conversation. There's things like, what's the consequence of that mistake? You know, if I worked with an HR group in one of the banks, and their director in HR never wanted to try an agile approach. He's like, it'll never work for us on our HR projects. And when we picked at it, it basically came down to, if I screw up payroll for 80,000 people, but I followed our existing process, that's actually better than if I tried this agile stuff and I messed it up. So when you talk about, you know, how to create that experimentation culture, it's a risk reward. And if I was in his position, I probably wouldn't want to take that risk either. That's a big thing. I mean, you run payroll for 80,000 people. It's not like you can go, oops, I forgot to deploy this configuration file and nobody got paid this week. Like that's no es bueno. But so risk reward for me. And a lot of the times as the external change agent, I'll try it first. I'll say, what experiment do you want to try? I'll do it, or blame me. I don't have the book here, but there's a great book from Patrick Lencioni called Getting Naked, talks about his naked consulting style. And one of the principles is take the bullet for the client. So if you're the external change agent, you try the experiment and you take the risk, and you say, if it doesn't work, you can just blame me. Because I think anybody is a consultant or has been one, you kind of expect to get fired. That's just kind of how consulting works sometimes. So if you take the risk to do the experiment, people are going to catch on eventually. And there's so many other factors, you know, how conservative is the culture? What's the consequence of the mistake? Lots of things. And yes, the other two questions, yes, I'll get to. I'll finish this last universal. This is the fifth one. I've never been a fan of the term change resistance. You know, you can, if you've seen version 1's State of Agile surveys, I think they're doing year 15 this year. And the number one reason for the last 15 years has been resistance to change. It's been the same between 55 and 60% of the respondents say Agile doesn't work because people resist change. And for me, that's kind of like saying, I don't know what happened, but it's everybody else's fault except for mine, because I'm the Agile coach who knows everything, which is crazy. So I much prefer to think about it as the response to change, not so much its resistance. Because if you think about, you can't control how people react to change. All you can do is react to their reaction. If people are really upset about it and they don't want to do it, that's actually a great thing in my view, because that's actually some data that tells you what you could do next. So it might not be the right time, it might not be the right change, there might be too many other things going on, but at least you can have a conversation about why nobody wants to do this. If nobody cares either way, that's harder because you don't really have any data to go on. So if we look at what that response is, then we can figure out, well, what could we do next? And the picture here, this was with a group of managers, and we kind of got to the point in this transformation where we thought that, like us, the Agile coaches, were in the way. Like maybe we were pushing too hard. Like something's going on. People just don't seem to want to do this, or people seem really tired. We need to validate that. So the coach I was working with, Andrew Annett, wrote this on the whiteboard. What are you tolerating? It was such an awesome question for a retrospective. And some of the things, you know, they wrote pace of transformation. One of the other stickies, you can't see it in the picture, but it was lunchtime meetings, transparency. It was things that were more related to the day-to-day work. And some of the transformation things we wanted them to do were in the way of them doing their day job. So we had a great conversation, and it helped reaffirm that we were there to help and support. We weren't there to get them to do stuff. And that's all based on just that mindset shift from not blaming them for resisting, but getting curious, not furious, and looking at what that response is. The other couple of questions, yeah, I'll save those to the open Q&A. They don't fit right into the spot where I'm at right now. So these 5 universals, I call them universals on purpose because it's things like, has anybody ever had a neighbor move in next door? Just throw a yes in the chat if you've ever had a new coworker or you've had a new neighbor move in. Now put something in the chat if you went over to Google and you went, what is the best practice for successfully integrating ROI with new neighbor? What's the 8-step process to follow to integrate relationship with new neighbor? Or like, who went and took a 2-day training course on how to, integrate a relationship with the new neighbor? Did anybody do that? Somebody always says yes, just to be funny. But no, of course not. You went over with a potted plant or some muffins or something, and yeah, let's ask for a cup of sugar. Yeah, we know how to do that as humans. Right? Like that's a universal thing that everybody can understand. If you ever visit a different country, a friend in a different country, you bring something from your own country there. That's just how humans are. So I called them universals on purpose because when we go into our organizations, we forget how to be human. We forget all those good things about building relationships and talking to people. And we focus on, okay, you're going to follow this 5-step best practice change process, which is so unnatural for us as humans. So I called them universals instead of values or principles because those things are, values and principles are human qualities. And I know all of the frameworks and methods out there publish principles and values and stuff, but they're either, number one, created to sell you something, or they reflect the values and beliefs of the creator. So universals are things that doesn't matter what country you're in, doesn't matter size of your company. These 5 universals are the 5 patterns that I found over the last 6-7 years that people were following to move things forward.